This is Rebecca Jernigan, your tour guide into discoveries, coming to you live from the heart of America to around the globe via the World Wide Web, satellite, and podcast. Let's journey together into the realms of the known to the unknown in search of enlightenment, knowledge, and truth. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are on this beautiful planet Earth. This is your host, Rebecca Jernigan, and you are listening to Journeys with Rebecca right here on wolfspiritradio.com and being simulcast on Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, Studio B. Please remember that both stations, Wolf Spirit Radio and Freedom Slips, are totally listener supported, so any donations really do make a difference, and it allows for all the wonderful show hosts and their guests to continue to provide the best and latest information, and of course, it's not mainstream. And don't forget to check out the website, journeyswithrebecca.com, and check out the archives, upcoming guests and topics, classes and workshops that I offer, as well as setting up an appointment for your session with me. And as always, the free newsletter there to sign up for. You find that on the left sidebar on each page you visit. And I'm revamping the website. It's still in work in progress, and all of the archives will be moved over to YouTube. When that gets completed, I will let everyone know, so they can go in there and hear a whole lot of shows from people that you have not probably been able to access for quite a few years, and some of them were pretty awesome. And speaking of awesome, we have a really great guest for you tonight. His name is Bruce Fenton. He's been on in the past, him and his wife. Tonight we're going to be talking about his book, The Forgotten Exodus, the Into Africa Theory of Human Evolution. It really was a fascinating book to read. Bruce started out doing some background fact-checking to support his suspicions of an Australian connection to the builders of a mysterious megalithic site in Ecuador. Having uncovered a link between the Lagoa Santa type people of ancient Brazil, he followed the evidence deeper into prehistory, leading to a proof of a forgotten history of Australian colonization of America. This account conflicted with the familiar narrative of human origins that involved a settlement of our planet by men and women walking out of Africa 70,000 years before the present day. Now, Bruce's investigations of the mysterious archaeological site in the Amazon jungle involved direct expeditions, meetings with government officials, and collaboration with an international team of experts. Now, this growing international coverage of his activities culminated in him appearing on the popular science show, The Unexplained Files. This episode was on the lost races of giants, but the video footage from the Ecuador expedition was also aired at the same time. Now, to say that his research has been an exciting journey would be a massive understatement. Really, incredibly, his small background task of fact-checking the human origins and early migrations spiraled into a mind-blowing recognition that there was an entirely lost chapter in human evolutionary history. Discovery after discovery pointed towards the stunning conclusion that the popular out-of-Africa theory for human origins was wrong, and that the understood colonization of our planet was utterly flawed. So without further ado, let me welcome my guest tonight, Bruce Fenton. Welcome, Bruce.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, and thanks for the great introduction. That really, it covers the whole backstory, of how I ended up doing this.
Well, it does fill in some of the blanks, but I also wanted to make mention, I forgot to do that, was that in your book, Graham Hancock wrote an absolutely powerful foreword for this book that I read. And I've actually interviewed him once. It's been quite a few years ago. Fascinating man. Definitely somebody that you would certainly look up to and listen to what he has to say, because he's, obviously done a lot of research and just tons of it in his life cycle. And he's worked with a lot of really big names, and So he's got a really good reputation about him as well. He's done some pretty phenomenal work, as well as you have. I want to, before you get started though, I want to talk a little bit about the footage that was shown on the Science Channel there on the, Unexplained Files.
Sure.
I did actually happen to catch that, because I follow a lot of the work. So some of these people have been guests on my show recently and some from the past when they've been, looking up this giant thing. And of course, there's a lot of cross correlation with some of these sites and everything. And I'm hoping maybe tonight that you can get into, specifically some of the sites as well, because you talk about them in your book, but also the correlation between what some of our audience research may have brought forward too for them own selves will help them to kind of connect their own dots in their own space that they're in tonight. And, I did forget to tell everyone if you have questions, and I hope that you do for Bruce, because he's a walking encyclopedia. He really is. How you keep all these facts straight, I don't know. But anyway, he's a walking encyclopedia, especially when it comes to this particular topic. So I hope if you have any questions tonight that you will place them in the chat box and you will put them all in capital letters so that we know that it is a question for our guests tonight. And so that being said, I know I've said a mouthful here already. So let's start with the beginning because I'd love for you to trip through the timeline. The timeline itself is very, very important. And as you're talking about it in the book, it talks about you use a, term that I'm not actually familiar with. I think you use Maya, as a, time, Maya, M-Y-A, like the period 6.8 to 7.2.
Oh, sorry.
Maya.
Yeah, so the abbreviations for million years ago. Sorry.
Ah, okay. I was like, okay, I kept looking for something like, what is Maya? I don't understand.
Yeah, no, sorry. I should put the little, what they call it, the, list of terminologies at the beginning, really. It should have. But yeah,
okay.
million years ago.
Okay. So MYA, when you say MYA, Maya, it means million years ago. Okay. Crap. All right, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just quickly respond to what you said there. Yeah, I think I probably have some mild OCD and autism because there's all this information somehow linked together in my brain somewhere. But yeah, there's a lot of data that has to interconnect to make the whole picture in this story. As anyone can imagine, it's a big story, human prehistory, and holding it into one narrative. Yeah, it's a fairly complex puzzle. I think, somewhere
really
in my brain, there must be a wire that's shorted out and it's all somehow works.
It happens. All right.
So, it's really, the story's long and it goes all the way back to, 5 million years ago. And it has emerged out of the work I did, obviously Ecuador and the stuff to do with, initially to do with giants and in a first draft of this book, I was talking a bit more about giants, but some of that's gone into my notes for, another book. But yeah, it really did begin with, with that side of it going into the jungle, obviously seeing there was the giant hammers and then that connected to, getting asked to go to Georgia and going up into the mountains there in search of giant bones. And, so there was, definitely, a strong giants connection there. And we still can't write off, whether, write off the idea there possibly being giants in the jungle. I still don't know for sure what those oversized objects were that people have seen pictures of now. Obviously in the videos and the photos around the web. They've been on a lot of websites and in a couple of books as well. Like L.A. Marzulli has used some of the photos in his latest book. And I know there's another guy, Xavier something, who's written a book about giants. Sorry, I can't use another name, but, has recently put out another giants book that's got some photos from the site that I've let them use. So, people would have seen those floating around, one way or another. And that still is a bit of a mysterious, aspect of it that, they've got these oversized objects and stuff. So,
Right.
it may well be that there is a giant sized, connection in there in terms of some of the people at these sites. I can't say for sure, but I'm certainly not, dismissing that.
Exactly. For sure.
But but really, yeah, I suppose from there it sort of dovetailed. And I ended up, yes, as you said in the beginning, I kind of did a bit of I was doing my background research. And it really, yeah, really sort of took me down the rabbit hole, you know, that I found that instead of just having a sort of brief chapter that, you know, again, it's my OCD and, and all of that. I thought, you know, I had to start at the beginning, Rebecca. You know, I'm one of those people, you know, I can't, I'm not good at starting halfway into something. So I thought, well, you know, I'll just take it back and we'll just, you know, we'll do a bit of a look right from 5 million years ago. Just, you know, follow the timeline along a bit, you know, and see when we sort of hit this point where it would join with my research. But yeah, I ended up really looking at the whole sort of arc from 5 million years ago up until about 20,000 years ago, and across continents, you know, across obviously, Africa, Eurasia, the Eurasian border, Georgia, and off into Europe, and then he goes into Asia, and then into Southeast Asia and Australasia. So I mean, I cover most of the habitable world. The Americas obviously was the starting point in terms of my actual research, although it doesn't really feature in this ebook. It really was the start of it. So yeah, I just ended up covering the whole sort of habitable ancient world. And one of the first revelations actually that, you know, comes in the book, and it's a bit of just a bit of a throwaway point the way I've done it, but is that, you know, even at the very beginning, there's some mystery there because some of the experts are admitting now that, you know, 5 million years ago or so, when we have this shared ancestor, at least for everyone who sort of accepts the classical theories of, you know, evolution, that there's this shared ancestor, you know, that gave birth to the twin lines of sort of modern chimpanzees and another line that was led to, you know, modern humans. That even that, you know, we're not really sure now as to whether that was an ape-like predecessor or a more human-like predecessor. And there's a few anomalies there that, you know, if we look at the way, like chimpanzees and gorillas and stuff move, they don't really move like other quadrupedic animals. I mean, you look at how a horse or a cow or sheep and stuff move, and you look at how these primates are moving. You know, they do what they call knuckle walking. It looks unlike, you know, those other animals, doesn't it? I mean, it's quite different. And, and one of the things that's pointed out there, and there was an anatomist, like a, you know, leading anatomist who was saying that, you know, it almost looks like the predecessor was a human-like, you know, ancestor, and that these primates have begun to become quadrupedal rather than the other way around. And I thought that's kind of a mind-opening thing to start with, that, you know, the academics are getting to that point where they're actually saying to us, well, maybe it was, you know, an ancient human-like being, because that's something that, you know, a lot of people in the, certainly in our alternate research community have speculated on anyway, isn't it? Is that, you know, ancient humans of some sort that existed millions of years ago, and that, you know, now even sort of some of that is coming out in academia, this idea that perhaps we've got it really wrong, even from, you know, right in the beginning of this story, which I found was quite was an interesting point to come in on, because, yeah, that links more with, you know, the anomalous histories that we read about in, say, you know, like ooparts and all this, and that, you know, place objects, and that was there some sort of ancient humans, you know, millions and millions of years ago. And yeah, and it's looking more like that's quite possibly so, you know, in terms of the hard evidence kind of even suggests that.
Exactly. And I want to make a point here too, is that some of this stuff that that you made in your book was that they've got different kinds of, dating now for some of the finds that they've had. They were just, you know, relying on carbon dating, and you explain it very succinctly in the book, all the different, methods that they are using now to go back and actually redate some of these things, and they found a whole lot of discrepancies from what was first there. And in the picture it gets bigger for them, because they're like, oh, so now we have to rethink this. So the whole book really that that you've written on, you time and time again talk about how, all of the scientists and the researchers are going back and going, oh, wait a minute, we need to rethink this. So there are a lot of people rethinking this. So it's really fabulous. So anyway, I just wanted to put that thought out there. So continue.
Yeah, no, it's just true. And, you know, in many cases, the revelations that people are seeing now in the media, you know, there's a lot of articles have come out recently about, you know, ancient hominins, whether in Africa or in Americas and stuff. And, you know, there's been a lot of, quite a flow actually in the last few months, hasn't there? But, you know, of big articles getting shared around, which are to do with this sort of human origin stuff. And a lot of that is to do with, reanalysis of existing fossils and sites where they've gone in and, using the latest technologies or new, interconnected sort of understandings of, you've gone back and looked at the old sites or the old artifacts rather than new discoveries. And that they're realizing that, there's a lot of information contained, in sort of known finds that they hadn't been able to access. And that, so a lot of these revelations are coming out of known finds. I mean, even that one in the Americas, that's the 130,000-year-old, human dinner. Apparently, somebody ate a mastodon, and smashed the bone. So that's a site that was found in the 90s. And there's been a couple others like that where, now we're starting to access more information from old finds. So it's not always about digging up a new bone, it's often, it's going back and reassessing something. That plays a big part in the story, I think, is the advances that we've got, now with the genetic technologies as well, there's obviously I put quite a focus on that. It's not all about, what bones and skeletons, we've got in the cupboard or whatever. It's just a lot to do with, what genes we can extract, and the ability now to sort of look, where those genes flowed to and things like that. So it's, we're in a sort of a different kind of world of archaeological discovery with all of these technologies and, all these, new lab experiments they can do. The early part of this story, and to begin from where we were just discussing, goes off into the first tool use, which is something that's recently has been reevaluated, because for a long time they thought Homo, as in the whole genus Homo, first appeared about 2.5 million years ago, and that was the first signs of, I suppose, human behaviour and human thinking, and that was with they've discovered signs of tool use, and that's how we came up with this first Homo, which was called Homo habilis, which meant the tool-using man, basically, and that he was in Africa around 2.5 million years ago, using stone tools, and that was considered to be the beginning of the human story, if you like. Before that we have these like Australopithecus and others, what they call like pre-Homo or pre-human kind of hominins, and recently that's all changed because they found that there's actually the signs of tool use earlier than that, going back to about 3.3 million years ago. And that's been a fairly recent, reevaluation. So they've already, they've pushed back that beginning part of this story by over around about nearly 1 million years. So that's been a big change. And then another find that's happened recently, which is more controversial, is, over in India at a place called Masol. They discovered evidence of both stone tools and, butchering of animals, bones with tool marks. And that's problematic. That one didn't get covered in this, version of the book. I'll probably have to add that in and update it, because that's quite an important find, because, of course, certainly the academics never would have thought that you'd find evidence of any kind of humans down in India, like nearly 3 million years ago. You can imagine there's a bit of backlash on the scientists involved in that, because the other academics were always saying, "Oh, well, this can't be true. This can't be true because humans are supposed to be, just appearing in Africa. Like, what are they doing down in India? So, it's kind of, you can see there's there's a problem there already, right early on in this story, that, if this had been even a couple of years ago, that would have made it the oldest, human related site on the planet. And it's only with this pushing back the date in Africa, that's happened recently as well, that it's kept Africa, if you like, just ahead. But otherwise, that alone would have been a bit of an, Achilles heel really for the theory. But it still is a massive problem, because the academics, none of them sort of believe that humans should be down in Asia that early. They're not supposed to come out the continent till around about a couple of million years ago. So that site is one people should keep an eye on if they ever look into, Masol and the discoveries there. And, there's going to be, I think, more discoveries there. The academics that are involved suspect that they might yet find, fossilized, human bones there, because they found animal bones and stuff. So that could get quite interesting, I think. And we see after that, we get on to I suppose the interesting point with the early humans is when you get towards Homo erectus, because Homo erectus is the first kind of global species. We don't know who these people were down in in India yet. I mean, they may have been really early Homo erectus, but certainly we know that Homo erectus is out of Africa, up in Georgia, in the mountains, in the Caucasus, around about 1.8 million years ago. It's down in Southeast Asia around the same time. Even in Africa, it sort of appears around about a couple of million years ago, what they consider to be classical fossils of Homo erectus, about 2 million years ago in Africa. So they're very close in time in Africa, in Eurasia and down in Southeast Asia. So they really are a truly global species. And they're in a way, they're where things kind of interesting, because up to that point, you're sort of talking about people that just do little more than, bang stones on things and, they get their flint knives and maybe cut up an animal. And that's their heights of their technology. It's with Homo erectus, we start to see things like, fire being used and, more advanced tools, and some really interesting stuff comes up with them, with looking like they're sailing. And, so yeah, it progresses rapidly once they sort of come on the scene, I mentioned the early part because, of course, yeah, as I say, there's this conflict now between Asia and Africa, which is important with my work because obviously I'm kind of looking down in that direction from Asia, Southeast Asia and Australasia as to be where I expect an awful lot to be going on. So it's funny that we're now seeing, sites that old down in Asia.
Well, the whole thing was this whole out of Africa thing, it really took a hold, right? It took a hold. So there's still going to be a lot of people, regardless how many facts and things, that they're still going to believe that it was all out of Africa and that they were the only humans, so to speak, right? Modern humans, that existed. And you're like, but what about all the other stuff they found all over the rest of the world? And your book kind of pulls that in together on the different sites. And of course you put the timelines in there as well. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that little tidbit out there, and please go ahead. This is great.
Yeah. So, so we've got this early conflict going on already between the regions. And then, so what we see is one of the key things about the find in Georgia. And also I like Georgia. I've been to Georgia. It's just a shame I didn't get to go to what they call the Dmanisi site where these skulls were found. But it's fun actually. The team I went with, actually they went, the film crew went, but I didn't get invited to.
Oh,
so I also was a shame. They're like, oh yeah, we're going off to meet the scientists at Dmanisi and see the skulls and stuff. And I had to stay in the hotel, so I was a little bit irked about that, but so I didn't get to go. But they went and filmed there, which didn't appear in the show actually, so that they obviously decided to not use that footage, which is a shame. But, so I was so near, but I didn't get there. But yeah, they found 5 skulls up at Dmanisi, and the interesting thing that happened there was that when they were analyzing these 5 skulls, they found that they were quite different to each other, and what they call there was a highly diverse morphology is what they would call it in terms of academic terms. Basically, all the skulls have a lot of differences in the way they appear.
So what you're saying is that each skull was different from each other, right?
That's right.
Is that what you're saying? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Like how I guess if we took somebody from like the Amazon jungle, somebody from like the Himalayas, someone else like a Maasai warrior or something, and you put them together, you see that kind of difference in the appearance. It's like that. Yeah. It was kind of equivalent to that. And they were really, really, really surprised because what they found was that there was like so much diversity between these 5 skulls that it suggested that Homo erectus was a hugely diverse, population. And in the past, they hadn't really understood that. So wherever they went, and found a skeleton, they would say, pretty much, oh, look, this could be a new species or this can be a new species. And so on the family tree, we have, quite a large number of species that are supposed to be, individual Homo species. And the scientists in Georgia said, look, basically, we think several of these are not real species and that we need to rethink this. Because, if there's this much diversity in just 5 skulls in one site, then we're talking about a global species of Homo erectus that has huge diversity, and that we probably need to shave off several of these, including like Homo habilis, who was as I say, was originally the first identified Homo. They actually think now that this is just an early Homo erectus, and the amount of difference between that skull and theirs is fairly insignificant. And that, we need to think now in terms of Homo erectus being rather like modern humans today, that when we look around the world, we see all this diversity. And that people have to, kind of get their head around the fact that, these, instead of seeing like, oh, this skull looks a bit different, and that one looks a bit different, that, okay, but then so do ours, that there's loads of modern humans with different appearances today. And that, unfortunately we hadn't understood that. And so people came up with all these different species, and they've got this big family tree. Pretty much that needs to be cut back down to, more like almost a stump, because it's going to be maybe a couple of branches on it, rather than all these spreading branches of this family tree. That's, to me, it looks like that's totally wrong. And that really what we need to look at is perhaps almost one singular line with these Australopithecus, who I think we should really probably be thinking about calling them Homo Australopithecus, I suggest in the book. Because if at 3.3 million years ago they're already using tools, then like that used to be the classical definition of a human, is that, okay, we're using tools, so you're Homo. In which case, like these Australopithecus aren't Australopithecus, they're Homo something. So I sort of suggest that name. I think that from then onwards, we need to really be thinking that, there's this flow of this early sort of Homo Australopithecus onto the beginnings of Homo erectus around about 2.5 million years ago. They're starting to become what you call like archaic Homo erectus or early Homo erectus. And then that flows on to becoming, what we truly see as Homo erectus. And then after that is where we get on to, these, or like the Homo sapiens and stuff. So it's a much narrower path than people previously thought, with this, like a river with lots of different, branches coming out of it. It's not really quite like that. It's more of a singular large river flowing, with a lot of difference in it and a lot of changes going on, but not really all these different species the way that we were all taught at school. So there's a lot of change going on.
Yeah, what's really fascinating is you talk about the 5 different skulls being found together, that they're different. Mm-hmm. It would, to me, that would indicate, like, we have different cultural, places here. You have people that are from China that are different from people from Japan, or different a little bit, different from people from Russia, et cetera, and so forth, and the list goes on, right? But we're global, right? Originally we were kind of in our own little spaces, and that far back to think that there may have been that much diversity in one spot. I mean, that to me, see, now the other part of me is waking up going, hey, I'd like to research this, because I think, we might have had a meeting of the minds here or something with 5 different races although they're all human of some sort, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, how interesting. Okay. I'm sorry. I just had to bring that up. I just thought that was pretty fascinating.
Yeah, because I mean, you wouldn't really expect, because usually, isn't it, even today, usually you'd think that if you were to dig in one site, that you'd get 5 quite similar skulls, So it's kind of funny that they did.
Yeah. And why would bring 5 of them together all in the same spot, I mean, especially again,
it's kind of strange.
More about that far back.
Yeah, it's weird.
What was
it is a
going
bit weird,
on?
because you would think, that it was like essentially one group, even if some skulls are slightly different datings to each other. But you'd think that, if you dug in, I guess like 1,000-year-old site or something in China somewhere, that all the skulls would be similar-ish. So it's kind of funny that, that's the way it worked out. And why they had that mix in that site, I'm not sure. It's kind of funny, but they are now suggesting that maybe parts of the Caucasus were kind of one of the routes between, like Europe and Asia. So it may have been that, over time, different groups that passed through, that these skulls may not all have been the same group. But I mean, as far as I understand, they suspect they are, because the dating is very close on them. So they think that they're probably the same group. So they can't be sure. But, it's funny. It's kind of funny. And so that site's really causing some turmoil, because it's not what they would have expected to see at all. And it's called into question of, the level of diversity that existed on the planet. Because if you see that much diversity in one little site, then you have to really think, well, what was it like across that whole population? And that, maybe they were even more diverse than we are today, because as you said, we would expect to see that like in one site. So, I think that, that there's really, it's opened a bit of a can of worms there, because, it says, well, how many of them were around? Because part of our diversity is the fact that there's like, billions of us,
there's billions of us now,
Yeah. So, I mean, we're going to have a lot of diversity, but nobody's thinking that there was 7 billion Homo erectus, but they must have a fairly large population to have anything like our level of diversity. It's hard to imagine that there was, like 10,000 of them, but yet they all looked completely different. I mean, that seems pretty unlikely. So, it does make you suspect that this is a much larger global population, at least at some point in that story, where I don't know if it goes up into, the millions and that, with catastrophic events, a lot get wiped out. Obviously that there's a few times in that ancient prehistory where there is like cataclysms and stuff. So it's possible that sometimes, that the population was very large and that, then there's been sudden events that have taken us down to, a few thousand, and you get this sort of snapshot of the diversity. So you get, it's like, I guess if a few people survive from, the Amazon, a few people survive from the Himalayas, and a few people survive from sub-Saharan Africa, and that those become the new population. They might not be many people, but you'd still have a lot of diversity. And it rather looks like maybe that's what happens is we do get expansions where there's quite a large number of these ancient sort of humans, and then they're like clobbered by natural catastrophes and end up being very small groups, but still with a lot of diversity.
Right.
And that happens a few times. I mean, because we do see, one of the things I've come to the conclusion that really an awful lot of this story is driven by catastrophic events, rather than being that, all about, brain size and innovation and one line being better than another. I think a lot of the human story is to do with a bit of blind luck, and weathering the storm, because, even going back to about, I think it's 1.2 million years ago. So it's still in the sort of the time of Homo erectus. They know that there was, some kind of global catastrophe underway then, which, took us down to about, I think they think around about between sort of 12 and 20,000, humans of any kind, across the planet. And that, we've just been literally, they don't know what this was, this particular catastrophe, but they find this evidence in the, in the genome. They find what they call, I forgot the specific term, but there's these very ancient, like genetic traces that show when there's been like a sudden drop in the population numbers. And they found this signature. So they know that there was one of these catastrophes then. And it's kind of funny because it's around that time that, we start to see, changes happening for like Homo erectus and starting to, I guess, what people call evolve, faster, the brain getting bigger. It's a bit not long after this, it's about the 900,000 years ago that we start to see a lot of significant changes. And I think that these events are important because one thing we know is that if you reduce a population down to a small size, and if there's any like mutations and genetic changes, they pass through a small population very fast. So of course, you're more likely to have a big jump forward or a jump backwards, depending if it's a negative or positive change. As if you've only got a few thousand people and obviously they're interbreeding, you're likely to then have that mutation passed on really quickly to, to the next generation until most of a population carries the new trait.
Right.
And that's something that happens, obviously is linked to these catastrophes. So there can be times when the sudden jumps happen. So it's kind of funny. I'll be honest. I mean, in some ways, I have suspicions about some of these, because I keep an open mind as to, as to whether or not they are all fully natural. I mean, obviously I'm a believer in, external forces and whatnot. I don't know if, is there some, intelligent race beyond which sends down a comet or something at, points through time. We can't be sure. I mean, obviously a lot of people say, oh, well, that's like totally nuts or something. But the thing is, we don't know. I mean, one thing I say is it does seem that we have these strange like catastrophes and then changes happen in the population and we seem to sort of leap forward. And literally all these big changes seem to follow that catastrophe, then the human brain starts getting bigger and, the body changes a lot. And around about, 900,000 years ago after this whatever it was, catastrophe. I find that is kind of fascinating itself that, these what we think of as really bad times are also seen to be the times when we make these big leaps forward.
Are you there?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I was just giving you a moment in case you wanted to respond.
No. I was thinking we lost connection there. I try to wait for a few seconds because I can tell that there's a delay between what you're saying and when I talk. So I try to wait until there's a little silence so that you can actually hear when I talk to you because there's that delay in there. There was a question that came in, and I know you addressed this a little bit in your book. If I can go ahead and interrupt this for just
Sure.
a moment, because we're at that 900,000 year ago mark, which was very significant. So I think it'll be easy
Mm-hmm.
for you to pick this back up. Somebody was asking about the hobbits or any of the other extinct hominids.
Mm-hmm.
What did you run across with that? I know that it's in your book, but, they would
Sure.
really like to know about that.
Yeah, I mean, that is around that time. Yeah. So about 1 million years ago, is the current date, they think, for when these hobbits ended up on Flores. And the thing about Flores is that, it was an island that was always cut off by deep, what they call deep water trenches. So, you can't just walk there just because, the sea levels are lower. Unlike a lot of other sites, it's a place that no matter when you look at it, certainly in the time that humans have been alive, that you would have had to have, either swam across or boated across. I mean, swimming is an unreasonable thing. I mean, there's like really strong currents, there's sharks and so. So, I mean, basically you kind of have to have been floating on something to get across there. Now there's a bit of obviously a divide between the people that accept like that boats were used and others that they want to try and say that, maybe people were washed across by waves on, bits of debris but I mean, that seems quite unlikely because somehow enough of these beings ended up on Flores to make a viable population that was there for like hundreds of thousands of years. So it suggests to most people that they must have used boats, or what they call watercraft. Because I mean, a watercraft is basically like rafts, and like dug out logs and, the really simple, forms of crossing water. And that, there's a strong suspicion there that they must have had something. It takes I think it's about 5 journeys, Rebecca, right, to get to this island. So to say someone's washed across in it is unreasonable because you'd have to be like washed across like 5 different journeys of being washed across by random waves and getting a whole, a founder population to the island. Like that's not reasonable in my mind to say that that's happened 5 times. It's much more likely that people had a raft and they've rafted across 5 times. But anyway, we know that about 1 million years ago they arrived because there's ancient stone tools that show that. And then more recently they found, the bones. They had the bones of hobbits that went back about 50,000 years, but then they found some more now that are about, I think it's about 800,000 years old. And so they know that the hobbits were what they call Homo floresiensis, were on the island going back. Essentially, if these stone tools were there, so going back at least 1 million years, but either way, certainly hundreds of thousands of years of occupation of the island. And they're a kind of mysterious race because now, as the scientists look deeper and deeper into that story, they're finding that these probably aren't, Homo erectus, and that haven't arisen out of Homo erectus, although that's the main species, down in Southeast Asia, on Java, and what we call Java man and all that, these are all Homo erectus that around 1.8 million years ago have made their way down towards Indonesia. And yet they say, no, hang on a minute, the differences between the Hobbit people and, these Homo erectus is so stark that we think that these have arisen from an earlier form, something more like what they have been calling Homo habilis, which is like kind of said earlier, is now a species that's being questioned anyway. But they seem to have risen from certainly an earlier form than Homo erectus. It might cause, I guess, I would probably call it something like archaic Homo erectus or one of these Homo australopithecus type beings. But something that was wandering around the planet over 2 million years ago seems to have ended up, down on Flores and has given rise to these Hobbit people. And there's a few like misnomers about them as well, because there's a lot of articles out there that go on about island dwarfism, and they'll say that, they got there, there wasn't enough, resources and food, so they shrunk down in size, because they see that in some of the animals there, like there was dwarf elephants and things on the island, and island dwarfism is a known phenomena. But the problem with that, firstly, is that we've never seen it happen that fast in a human population, that they've arrived and within, a few 100,000 years that they're tiny. That just doesn't happen anywhere else. And the other thing is that when they found these earlier bones, it turned out that in fact that they were smaller when they were there, earlier, and that they actually got bigger. And a lot of the articles aren't saying that. It's kind of funny. You can still see them talking about, and these, the dwarfism that occurred. It's like, but hang on a minute, that's not what the evidence says at all. Like, and it's funny often you see like mainstream press just repeating, without actually checking that, because, what they actually found was no, it's the opposite. and that they, you know, that they were already small. They were just like little people. And somehow these little people with these little tiny brains were the first people to invent rafts and sail across, you know, to the island and stuff. So there's like a mystery with that as well. And it raises questions about how big does the brain need to be to do like complex thinking and stuff? Because I'm not being funny, like if you've got a population on Java and you want to get to like Flores, you've got to sort of organize that, haven't you? I mean, I don't really believe that you can just like jabber like a monkey jumping in the air and pointing at the sea and that somehow you sort it out, you know. I think you've got to be able to communicate, you know, and you've got to be able to engineer, you've got to be able to build the raft and stuff. So like, I think that, you know, there's some big red flags about the presence of anyone on Flores a million years ago, which suggests that they could communicate in some way. No, I don't know how they were communicating. I suspect that they had a rudimentary language. I think that they had what we call click language, which is what we see in sub-Saharan Africa amongst the Khoisan people. And it's basically a language structured around clicks, whistles, hand gestures, and a few words. And that's considered to be the oldest language on earth that we know of today. And it also would suit early hominins because it doesn't require an awful lot of words, you know. So if you've got problems with articulating words because of the physiology, obviously there's certain aspects of our physiology which suit, you know, vocalizing, and that's taken a while to evolve, if you like. But certainly, I don't think there was any particular time when we couldn't have clicked or whistled or waved our hands around, you know what I mean? So this language would have suited people at that time. I strongly suspect that they had it because I think to try and convince people to sail across a dangerous sea, you know, and to construct significant sized rafts to carry them there, like that takes some organization, doesn't it? I really don't believe that it just happens, you know. I think that, yeah, you've got to be able to explain to the other people, haven't you, that you want them to go to the island and why and like how we're going to get there, what we're going to do there. Because otherwise it's a very unconvincing thing, isn't it? Just pointing at the wild sea and I mean, that's not like, I don't really see that. So yeah, that Flores find is raising a lot of like issues and possibilities. And also there is another possibility there as well that has been suggested by a couple of academics that, you know, it is kind of easier to actually go from the east of those islands, like from what they call like Sulawesi and stuff, towards Flores rather than from Indonesia to Flores. So there is the suggestion that maybe we were traveling west rather than east. And that raises some other like possibilities. For instance, that maybe we're coming from what is today, like Guinea, like New Guinea and Papua and heading west, in which case it means that the people were coming from Australia, you know, and we're heading west. So, and that's something that's a possibility. I mean, I've tried to stick with the strongest evidence in the book, you know, so I say, you know, that we're heading from, you know, we've headed down, from sort of Africa through Eurasia, and the people have come down into Southeast Asia and crossed onto Flores and carried on and got to Australia. Because once you've gone to Flores, you're over the big divide, what they call the Wallace Line, which is a geological divide between Southeast Asia and Australasia. Once you cross that, there's no reason why you don't go into Australia. And that's accepted by most academics. They say if you cross the Wallace Line, you've done the hard work. You know, you'd assume that anyone who does that would get into Australia. Well, these Hobbit people are on the other side of the Wallace Line. There's no reason why. If they can get to there, then why they're not in Australia. So that as well is a big issue about these Hobbit people, that they should technically also have been in Australia. And there is that possibility that they're actually coming out of Australia and that we see these beings that are, as they say, very archaic or very, you know, very primitive like, and like what are they doing down there so early? It does raise like this tantalizing possibility that what we're seeing is the evolution of even these oldest, you know, humans being down in that region and not being in Africa. So that's something that, you know, although I don't state it in the book, I think I a couple times touch on this possibility. But yeah, the evidence is kind of suggestive that we need to really be prepared for I think some big revelations perhaps to come yet in this story. And that we may find that the entire thing of humans like evolving in Africa may yet collapse. And we may find that it was always waves of people coming up from Australasia and Southeast Asia and migrating up into Africa right from the early stages. You know, and as I say, this site in India with possibly dates going up to maybe 3 million years ago. Again, that raises some big questions in that direction. It's like, you know, which way is this migration happening at the beginning? Is it coming out of Africa or is it coming out of Asia? And that I think is, very worthy of people out there just, you know, keeping an eye out for information that suggests it may be the other way, because I had a sneaky feeling that, that it's going to head that way, and that we're going to see that at some point in the next few years, perhaps a total collapse of the out of Africa, not just the Homo sapiens part of the story, but all the way back.
Yeah, and I think that there's going to be a lot more discoveries. I think as our scientific tools that they have in order to be a little bit more honed in on where to dig for some archaeological evidence, I think is also going to become very, very much in the mainstream as far as in that, arena. And I think we're going to find a lot more evidence of different things that haven't even, all these things that people have been scratching their heads over. There's going to be, the answers are going to happen for them. And then that in itself is also going to raise some additional questions. So it's going to be, I think it's exciting. It's an exciting time because we're getting more and more information, as time goes on. And the more information we get, we have to sit back and rethink, well, maybe this isn't the way it is. Maybe it's some other way. And I'm glad to see that some of these researchers and scientists and all of the likes of them are sitting back and going, well, I think I need to rethink this and look at this differently. And they're actually getting outside of their own box and really trying to figure it out. Because if you are a true researcher and a true scientist and you want the answers, you don't just stop because you think you've reached a conclusion. If somebody else brings you another idea, it's tantalizing to you. It's like, oh, well, maybe there is something more to this, and maybe there is something more yet to discover. So it's exciting.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's good to see, at least to some degree, that these academics are keeping their minds a bit open. Obviously they're a bit slower in accepting radical changes than anyone else, but yeah, that there is some head scratching going on, publicly. They don't really understand, how these hobbits fitted in, to this picture. And there's definitely, there's been a few things that have happened as well. Before I sort of go forward in the timeline, so I just pick up around them, because also we found that, there's a couple of studies that were done which have changed things for the academics. And there was one was up in Spain at a site called, was it the pit of bones? Was it Cueva de los Huesos? And which basically they found that, there was these hominins, and they called Cima de los Huesos, and they called the Cima hominins. And at that site, they found these bones. They're about almost 500,000 years old. And they managed to extract DNA. Initially, they extracted, mitochondrial DNA, and they were thinking that these were some kind of separate, Cima hominins, a new species again. But then what they eventually found, when they managed to get the nuclear DNA, which was the first time to get nuclear DNA at that age, because, obviously 500,000 years old is pretty old. Nobody thought that they could do it. They managed to extract it and did the testing. And what they actually found was that these were like early Neanderthals. And one of the things that there's a couple of things about that actually, because not only were they early Neanderthals, they also found a sign of Denisovan DNA, which is something we'll come on to, the Denisovans. But whilst they were doing this analysis, they realized that these were like ancestral Neanderthals, but that they were already well on the process sort of into becoming Neanderthals already at nearly 500,000 years ago. And so that meant they had to take this split between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, like well back. And now it's got to a point where most academics, I think, are understanding that the split had to have happened at least around 700,000 years ago. One of the leading academics has said, look, we really need to be looking for a sort of population that lived between 700 and 900,000 years ago if we're to find the ancestors of Homo sapiens, like modern humans. And there was another study done by the University of Indiana, and they were doing a comparative fossil study in Europe, where they looked at basically like fossils spread all across Europe of ancient hominins, mostly teeth and jaw bones, but they were looking specifically for the ancestor of modern humans. And what they found was that all of the fossils across Europe are all related to early Neanderthals and not to Homo sapiens, right? Or not to modern humans. And so this is a problem because those populations in Europe, like they call Homo heidelbergensis, obviously Homo erectus, these all have like representative populations in Africa. So when they took, pulled these out as being like, so they said, look, none of these are archaic, modern humans. They're all Neanderthal relatives. That means that all of the same populations in Africa can't be our direct ancestors, right? So in one fell swoop, the academics lost all of their possible ancestors for us. And that's something that hasn't really sunk in with a lot of people, I think. And even with the academics, that's a massive problem, because for years they've been telling us, well, Homo heidelbergensis, that was the predecessor and it gave rise to Neanderthals and modern humans. Well, now they know that's not true. Homo heidelbergensis was basically an early Neanderthal. And it's like, well, hang on a minute then. So there is no ancestor in Africa, right? So, because all you've got is, you can jump further back, yeah, you've got Homo erectus and stuff, but we know that there's an in-between stage. We know that, and we're not seeing it there anymore. So it's like, well, if it didn't happen there, where did it happen? And so they've pushed the dates back. And the study done by, the University of Indiana, they were even saying that maybe it was as early as 1 million years ago this split happened. But, so I mean, again, I think, we certainly have to be looking at a population around about, somewhere in that 900,000 years, 800,000 years ago, to actually find this ancestor. And that's a problem. So straight away, we don't see that ancestor in Europe. We don't see it in Africa, right? And this is why in my book, obviously, it's a detective process in a way, because it's not as simple as saying, we found a 5 million year old human fossil in Australia. There we go. We found it. It's not like that. I mean, we have to look at each place in turn to really narrow down the field to see, well, where is this happening? And also look at the genetic data, because it starts to lead you that way. Because, then there's the Denisovans, which has been, a bit of a hot topic in the last few years, because,
Absolutely.
You move across, go through Eurasia, you head from sort of Neanderthal territory in Europe. And as I say, they found traces of Denisovan in the genome of these like early Neanderthals. So they know there's been contact, in the ancient past. And the funny thing is they said that in later Neanderthals, they don't see the traces of Denisovan anymore. So this link between them is really deep, really early, and somewhere else, not in Europe, because it fades out in Europe. And this is one of the misnomers about Neanderthals. People have always been taught that Neanderthals were a European species. And that's not true, because what they're really finding is that, there was greater genetic diversity in the fossils of Central Asian and East Asian Neanderthals. So the suggests a larger, source population is in Asia. And this idea of the European Neanderthal is another thing that needs to go into the garbage bin of history, really, because, and they're carrying Denisovan DNA. So they must have carried that from somewhere else. We know that we weren't in Europe, so they must be carrying it from Asia. So they're another species that have walked west, into Europe. They've not come out of Africa. And there was no Neanderthals in Africa, which people have to understand as well. So, Neanderthals are not an African species, and they've carried Denisovan DNA from somewhere, and Denisovans weren't in Africa. So that narrows down which way they can be coming from. So you have to follow that path back, and obviously it heads east. And as you head sort of across into Central Asia, you come to the Denisova Cave, and the Denisova Cave basically has produced a mixture of Homo sapiens. Well, actually, they're all Homo sapiens. I should just quickly say that if you look at it really, there's Homo sapiens sapiens, it's like us. There's Homo sapiens neanderthalensis and Homo sapiens denisova. All three are interbreeding, interrelated, but they're different enough that we can talk about them as being different types of humans. But so they find these fossils there, they extract the DNA, discover, it's a new species, it's Denisovans, but they've split from us about 800,000 years ago, further supporting this early divergence between the different kinds of Homo sapiens. And then from there, you sort of trace that, you think, well, okay, let's see, were they living there? Is this the home of the Denisovans? So they did testing of the local people. No traces of them. So they tested further. They did testing of people in Europe, no genetic traces. And then they go, down to Asia. In East Asia, you find that people typically have about 0.1% Denisovan DNA. So, got a slight trace of them. But it's only as you go down through Southeast Asia and down into Australasia that you really find this big signature for them, around 6% in Guinea and in parts of northern Australia and some of the islands in Indonesia. You've got, significant traces. So again, that suggests that they weren't living in Central Asia, because you'd expect to see that trace strongly around the Denisova Cave if that was part of their heartland, and we don't see it at all. So this is the fringes of their territory, and in East Asia you find other anomalies, because as you move down into China, they found Homo sapiens remains that go back 180,000 years in some of the caves there. But that's a big problem because, we're not supposed to have gone out of Africa yet, in the story. And there's traces of, of what appear to be Denisovans. They think looking at some of these fossils, they suspect they're Denisovans. They found, there's traces of Neanderthal remains. There's what they call Homo sapiens adultus. There's all sorts there.
Well, hang on, Bruce, and I'm telling you, what a fascinating conversation. You guys, we're going to take a short break. We'll be back at the top of the hour. You're listening to Journeys with Rebecca. Stay with us.
Radio, and now we return you to your host.
Welcome back, everyone. You are listening to Journeys with Rebecca right here on wolfspiritradio.com and Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, Studio B. Tonight's guest, for those of you that just may be joining in, is Bruce Fenton, The Forgotten Exodus, the Into Africa Theory of Human Evolution. Welcome back, everyone. Bruce, how are you doing there? You back with us?
I am, yes. Yep, I'm doing good, thanks. And it's nice.
Listen, you're just, I am just mesmerized by this conversation. Truly, I am. This is really, fascinating to listen to what I've read. I read your book. And so this is just really fascinating to take what I read and listening to you and putting it together. It makes a more complete picture for me. So I want to thank you again for joining us. We talked about you're welcome, the Denisovians. But there was a question. Do you want to hold off on that question for a little bit while you finish that Denisovians, angle, or do you want to take the question now and then continue on with where we left off?
Yeah, no, I can take the question quickly.
Okay. So the question came in earlier. Are there any correlations between your findings and the Urantia books?
I mean, over the years, I've heard a bit about the book, but I've not read it. I know little bits about it. And from what I can understand, that it posits that, essentially that human evolution was, in line with the academic theory, that there's gradual changes over time, that the planet comes into form 4.5 billion years ago. So there's a lot of correlation there. But that the biological evolution of humans, is said to sort of start around 1 million years ago. I suppose the correlation there would be that that's about the time that Homo erectus is starting to diverge into new forms. As I say, this is around that time when there's this big cataclysm, and after that is when we start to see the initial early Homo sapiens. So yeah, there is a bit of a correlation there, 'cause they suggest the emergence of humans having occurred about 1 million years ago. And so that's in line of when they appear. But I mean, I think in the Rancher book, they suggest that's when we branched off from more primitive primates. But I would think that the Homo erectus weren't that primitive. They were still, they were still human, and they were still, able to go about their, human activities. So I suppose where it differs perhaps that the Urantia book suggests people pre 1 million years ago were more primitive than they seem to really be in what we're finding now. But yeah, certainly that's an interesting time for them to pick, because it does seem that's when, the earliest evidence of a change towards Homo sapiens is underway. And that, so there is that concordance there. I can't say beyond that, only because I haven't read the whole book. So I can just say that I can see some interesting, coincidence, if you like, at least between that choice of the date of 1 million years ago.
Okay, awesome, great, thank you. And the person that asked that, I'm sure they're going to appreciate that answer that you gave as well, because that's very good. So we have another question that I think we'll go ahead and take, because it's I think it'll be easier for us to get back into where you were going. What does the guest think of the elongated skulls?
Yeah, I've done some pondering. Yeah.
I'm sorry?
I've done a bit of pondering on that. I mean, one thing I have noticed, I think, is that we do see, some slight elongation of some of the Homo erectus skulls, and also there's been some elongated skulls found in Australia amongst, some well, not that early humans, but people that were living around about, I think it's around 15,000 years ago down near Willandra Lakes. There's some people which, called the Cow Swamp people that, they excavated a site there. They found a number of skeletons, and that a lot of these skeletons have got elongated heads. So yeah, it is something that I've come upon, and I do wonder if it's not some kind of link to Homo erectus. I think that they seem to have a distended back of the head, and some of these archaic humans had, a more elongated head. So we might be seeing some kind of, genome, a genomic explanation to at least some of these elongated heads. Yeah, obviously some of them are really anomalous. And, there's the missing suture in the skull, and there's other features like a larger brain case. But I mean, a larger brain case as well is something we see in some of the early humans as well. That it's not always linear, that, it's got bigger and bigger and bigger. That's not necessarily true, that there's been, finds of hominins that have larger brain cases than modern humans. So again, it may be that at least some of these skulls are, related to, I guess, offshoots of Homo sapiens that still had the bigger brain space and had the elongated skulls. Others, I don't know. There are some that are anomalous. Obviously, we all know that there's some that are just really weird, that have, this missing sort of suture in the skull, which is, a very odd thing. So I can't say that covers all of that story, but yeah, I suspect that at least some of them will yet be explained as being related to these other, hominins.
Yeah, kind of an intermixing, and we'll carry that conversation on for another time.
Sure. The elongated skulls, is a big subject in its own right.
That and the giants. Somebody's already asking about that as well. So, how about if we just continue on with your, with where you were going with all of this, and then we'll get into some of these other things, after you're done with getting all of these linkage up, because this is really fascinating, as far as the information that you've been able to correlate, with the migration, I'll call it, of the genomes that they're finding, and then the skulls and pieces of bone and all of this, and where all of this may have started. It is really fascinating. So please go forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're at a good place there to sort of go into some of the, I guess the more Homo sapiens related story. So obviously we've dealt with the foundations to this, and where people were and where they weren't, and, the timeline. So really, things get interesting after this kind of million years ago, is where we see this transition. And really, as I said, once you've ruled out like Europe and Africa, you're only left with Asia, Southeast Asia, and Eurasia. And like in China, they found these Homo sapiens, remains 180,000 years old. The oldest, of fully modern humans, like in the world, even the Homo sapiens in Africa, in East Africa, they've been found around about between 160,000 to 190,000 years old. And that these are more archaic, as they call it. They look more, they have more, ancient traits in the skull, the larger brow ridges and things. So the Chinese are arguing that their finds are fully modern humans, which is another controversial aspect of this find, as well as the date. But so there's something going on there in East Asia, and they're digging up. At the moment the Chinese are really on a bit of a mission. There's been a lack of archaeology really across like East Asia and Southeast Asia for a long time, that they're really sort of picking up the ball now, and they're finding some really cool sites. And the Chinese have found a number of cave sites in the last few years. We've got Homo sapiens remains. And they're arguing that Homo sapiens must have evolved there. And the Chinese obviously is a very proud nation. They're quite keen to prove that, obviously even from the propaganda point of view as well, to say, we were the first people and stuff. They kind of like that idea. So they're throwing some money now into their archaeological research, which, is a good thing. Okay, they might be doing it from a nationalistic point of view, but they're finding sites, and they're going out and they've got the money now going into their sciences to do this. And so, they're turning up a lot of sites. So I think we're going to see a lot more coming out of that area, but already we're getting these, revelationary finds. I mean, they've tried testing some of the remains to see if there's Denisovan DNA, but they haven't managed to extract viable DNA yet. But they are finding a lot of fossils. So East Asia is really, where we sort of pick up because things seem to be really happening there. There's a whole lot of different types of hominins. They're finding very different skulls and stuff there. So they know there's a lot going on in that region, but it would be tempting to say, okay, we found where Homo sapiens have evolved because, we've got these like nearly 200,000 years old remains there, so there's that argument say, okay, well, they must have been there, but it's not really as simple as that. And as I sort of in the book, I point out that, we're still having to address these Denisovans, because they're also like an anatomically modern human. And so where are they evolving? Have they evolved there? And as we've said, the signature for their presence is kind of there in the bones. Yeah, okay, maybe some of these bones are Denisovan or hybrid, but we're not seeing the gene in the genome of Chinese people. Right? What we're finding is that they have like 0.1% Denisovan. And that's not a big signature. When you think that like all non-African people have around 2 to 3% Neanderthal DNA, right? So, okay. So if the Denisovans were living in China, we'd expect to see at least a comparable level, of Denisovan genetics, right? But we don't. And the only place where we find that is when we go down across through Southeast Asia and down to Australasia. And that's why I sort of say, look, you can't stop at China because it doesn't make sense because there's this missing population. And if you follow the trail down, you find obviously, as we said, the Hobbit people, so someone's sailing around down there. We know that those people, whoever they were, would have been able to cross into Australia or were already in Australia. Either way, there's a very strong argument to say that by a million years ago, somebody is in Australia. And what happened to them? What's going on down there? So that's, we get sort of dragged down that way to kind of like solve this mystery really, because, it's down there that we do find, some anomalous, discoveries, particularly in the genome. And that we find that, basically the only signature of these Denisovans, is in people in like northeast Australasia, up in Guinea and in northeast Australia, where you've got around 6% of the genome is from these Denisovans. So that's been a big, news story in the last year or so. I mean, most people would have seen that. And also they found that there's evidence of another mysterious, human line amongst the people in Guinea. And there was a lot of headlines, fourth mysterious species found in Papua and all this stuff. So there's a lot been coming out of there. And this is where we see, I can go a bit into Africa's, because personally, I think that the evidence is stacking up heavily towards migrations going the other way. That basically around 200,000 years ago, there's another one of these like global catastrophes. There's something going on. We know that there's, droughts and climatic shift and like a huge die-off of humans again. And I believe at this point, there's a small group who make their way out of that region and heads west and ends up heading into Africa. Because they found in one of these genetic sampling experiments, they found that there's evidence of a missing population down in Australia, that there's a sign in the genome of another like modern human branch. And they say, they think they came in from Africa, but they died off. But you can equally say that they left Australasia and that's why their signature fades out, because this one group is no longer interbreeding with the others because they've left. And that then you find that, around about 200,000 years ago, that there's the first Homo sapiens skeletons in Africa appear in East Africa. Now, I say to anyone, look at a map, go Google it, look at where the Omo and Herto sites are. And these are the earliest known Homo sapiens, fossils in Africa. And there's a glaring anomaly there, because if you say that, we've evolved in Africa, we ranged across Africa, we got to a point where our species left, we populated, huge swathes of Africa and then moved out into the world. Well, it's kind of funny because when you look on that map, you find that the only places you found Homo sapiens are right in East Africa, near to this, in Ethiopia, not far from what they call the Bab el-Mandab Straits, which is one of the easy entrance and like access and, exit points from Africa. So that's kind of funny, isn't it? Because in that whole vast continent, the only place you find these early Homo sapiens is near to an entry point in East Africa, right?
Right.
That to me is a red flag, because why aren't we seeing them everywhere? Why are we only seeing them next to this area where you could have, literally crossed into Africa? And that's precisely what I think happened, is that we crossed into Africa, and that's why we only see these sites at the moment. We're only seeing them there, nowhere else in the vast African continent. That's kind of anomalous. And people don't seem to, that doesn't seem to have clicked, for people that, you look at that map and you tell me that we were an African species. Why aren't we all across Africa? Why is it we're just there? And there's other reasons to suspect that there's something going on there as well. But the 200,000 years ago, I say is, the first of these inter-Africa migrations. And that, we've expanded up through East Asia. And as I say, they found Homo sapiens remains there going back to 180,000 years ago. And I would expect that because if a migration is underway from Australasia and Southeast Asia, moving up through East Asia and into, Central Asia and on into Africa, then I would expect to see some really old modern humans and, and Homo sapiens in East Asia. And we do. Precisely as I'd expect, because along that trail, you're going to find, some evidence of them. And we are finding it. And then, so it's kind of funny. And then, so that's one migration, which again, it tallies up again with one of these catastrophes. And that's why I say I think catastrophes drive a lot of these stories, and a lot of our evolution is through catastrophe. And because the next one is around about 70,000 years ago. And this is probably, I guess, the really impactful one and the major one that interests people because it involves a known massive disaster, which was the explosion of the Lake Toba supervolcano. And they've dated this to around about 74,000 years ago now. They're pretty sure that they've got actually 73,880 apparently. So with a 95% confidence. So they're pretty sure it happened then. And like Lake Toba was situated on what's called the Sunda Plate. And the Sunda Plate basically incorporates a lot of Southeast Asia and Indonesia. It was an enormous landmass. It's sunk now because of the rises at the end of the Ice Age. The sea level rises up to 100 meters and beyond have swallowed most of it. But this was a vast area. And basically sitting on it was the Lake Toba supervolcano. And this is a point in time when we were still in the Ice Age. So when you're in the Ice Age, a nice place to live is the equator. And this is right on the equator. Indonesia sits on the equator. So as with equatorial Africa, humans are drawn to this warm belt. And so are a lot of animals, plants, everything, if you want to be anywhere during the Ice Age, you want to be on the equator, which is, it's normal. So you're going to have these condensed populations in equatorial Africa and in Indonesia, Sahel, Sunda, these two massive plates. You're going to have a lot of people condensed, into the, Southeast Asian region, if you like. The problem is that, that bang smack in the middle of it is a supervolcano, and this roared into life. And this is, considered to be the greatest natural catastrophe of the last certainly eruption-wise, of the last 2.5 million years. So, it makes things like Krakatoa look like, a firecracker going off or something. It's incredible. You've got, let's just see, 7 trillion tons of volcanic material ejected during a 14-day eruption, right? I mean,
Wow.
Incomprehensible, isn't it, really?
It is. When you put it into those terms, yeah.
Yeah, 7 trillion tons is unimaginable. I can't even visualize what that looks like, but we get the idea. This is extraordinary. There's 800 cubic kilometers of ash that rolls across South and Southeast Asia and out into the ocean. And they said literally millions of square kilometers of land were covered in debris. You've got, obviously the immediate pyroclastic zone within about 100 to 150 kilometers of the caldera. And that would have been scorched to a barren hellscape. It was just searing hot gases and ash flowing out across the land. 2,800 kilometers squared of magma being produced. It's awful. You can't imagine. Suddenly, it's like, if this was the Eden of humanity, it's been turned into hell overnight. That it's just absolute catastrophe. And people within the immediate zone, they're dead. There's however many people were living. I mean, those ones are all dead. The people on the edges, they're going to get the fallout. And obviously, as I say, this is going on for 14 days. You're going to have major earthquakes, probably up into who knows, beyond the 9 in the Richter scale, mega quakes, And obviously those induce tsunamis. We all saw what happened in the Asian tsunami, a few years back, when we had, a powerful earthquake in that region. It's a very active region. You would have had tsunamis like that rolling out, this is, it's very difficult to survive something like that. So anyone within, within hundreds of kilometers, they're kind of doomed. If you're further enough out, you get some time to move, but you'd start to see, the skies would be darkening, the rain would come as acid rain, water would be poisoned, plant life starts to die off through the increasing cold and obviously the toxicity. Devastating, absolutely devastating. And this is, I believe, it induces two major events. One is another exodus out of that region, and the other thing is a die-off of hominins. That, the people say, what happened to all of our human cousins? And that's always been a mystery. Like, why is it that, Homo sapiens sapiens is the lone survivor? Because people, is it because we're so great? We've got this big brain and, we did all these wonderful things and we must have, killed all the Neanderthals and killed the Denisovans and displaced everyone, and that's long been sort of taught to us. That's the picture we were given, isn't it? That that we've sort of done away with all of our competitors. And I don't think that's true at all. I think that what's really happened is that you've got a large community of Denisovans are the main inhabitants of this region now on Sunda at that time. And to their north, you've got Neanderthals, a region from like China going across to Europe is largely dominated by Neanderthals. Then all down through Southeast Asia, these Denisovans. And then down into Australia, you've got more Homo sapiens sapiens like people who are living down there. And so in the luck of the draw, the people in Australia are all right because the cloud is moving northwest. It eventually covers the entire northern hemisphere of the planet, right? And this goes into like a nuclear winter. So anyone up in the north is in trouble. Some pockets survive. We know that Neanderthals in Europe, some of them survive, but they're devastated too because they go extinct by about 35, to 40,000 years ago. And nobody really knows why, they would say. But, when you put two and two together, you can see this is a declining population. It's been devastated. The Denisovans as well vanish around that time. They're not able to come back from this. We're fortunate because our area was down in the south, which wasn't prime real estate. It was colder. So we'd been a bit forced out, but luck of the draw is that our ancestors were sitting on land that was pretty safe. The same as in Africa. What they've found now is that they used to think that this event was catastrophic the world over, but now they're realizing that it wasn't really that bad for the southern hemisphere. So people in equatorial Africa and South Africa, they also weather the storm in another one of these survival zones. So through a bit of luck, you've got pockets of Homo sapiens in both South Africa and in Australia. They're able to weather this, and that most of their cousins, these other Homo species, or Homo lineages, I prefer, are stuck in the northern kill zones, and so most of them go, and we see a loss of. I believe it was an enormous population. I'm not sure how big. We may be talking about hundreds of thousands. We may even talk about millions, but there was a large population on Sunda when this happened, I believe, and so we see a forced migration. So anyone who survives the immediate effects, but is, cut off to the north or to the west to this event, you can't really make your way down into Australia because you've got to go through the kill zone. And like, obviously there's no food there. There's nothing there, and there's potential to still be, caught in further eruptions or earthquakes. So you can't really head that way. It forces you to move west. The cloud is coming to the northwest. It's gradually swirling around the planet. If you can head west fast enough and you make your way into Africa, then you're safe. That's the only way to survive this if you can't get into Australia. And it's funny that around this time, 70,000 years ago, which is classically seen as the dating of the first, population of the planet by Africans, if you reverse that migration, it makes a lot more sense. That rather than Africans coming out, populating the world, what you're seeing is a line of people trying to get into Africa. So it's kind of incredible, really.
Bruce, I'm getting a lot of garbling effect. I'm not sure if JP can hear that.
Yeah, he's coming across really clear.
Okay, because it was very garbly when I was listening to him. So I don't know if we've got a bit of a little hiccup there or what's going on.
No,
But I
everything's
just
fine.
wanted to make mention of the. Okay, good. Okay. I'm sorry to interrupt that, Bruce. But you bring up a lot of extremely logical points to all of that as far as why we saw a decline in certain species, right? The Denisovians
Hmm.
and all of that. That was actually really fantastic information, especially when you put it into such correlation as what you did. I mean, that was just, my mind is still trying to get over the whole tonnage thing. Trillions
Yeah,
of
I mean,
tons of stuff. I'm like, well, what would that look like? It would
yeah.
change landscaping for sure, right?
Yeah, it sounds like having a country dropped on your head, doesn't it? So, it's just an immense amount of material, it's, just obliterated, it's, beyond, I don't know, beyond imagining, really.
It
Beyond
is. It
imagining.
is. So where do
It's
we
just,
go from here? What happens after this?
okay, so yes, you've got this. Well, there's a couple of interesting things about this point. So 70,000 years ago, which again, I say, everyone has to keep in mind that this is the mainstream date for the populating of the planet. They say, humans came out of Africa 70,000 years ago, populated the planet. And obviously I'm reversing that. I'm saying that, yeah, I agree with some of what they're saying, because if you look at the evidence, they say, well, we think that people moved along through Asia, through coastal Asia and ended up down in Southeast Asia and then crossed into Australia around 60 to 50,000 years ago after doing this migration along the coastlines, right? And having come through the Levant region, the Middle East, and then down. Okay, yeah, but that doesn't make any sense, because what they found is that, the paleoclimatologists, the leading experts were looking and they said, look, there is the worst, drought and, catastrophic environment going on, in the Levant 70,000 years ago. They said, in fact, it's the worst time for humans to choose to leave Africa. Like, it basically said, it's the worst possible moment to do it. Like, it doesn't make any sense, right? Like, why do you leave your perfectly good, lands and walk into like a barren hellscape, Like, who does that? Like, nobody does that. So it doesn't make any sense. And they're starting to, like, again, there's this head scratching for the academics because they're having to explain this. And then the other thing is that they found that, if people have gone down along the coastlines and gone into Australia, which in itself is kind of weird, like, because if we're populating the world, why aren't we like moving across the whole world? Why is it we just go along the coast of Asia and down into Australia? It's a very strange route for migrating people. That instead of like, you've got the whole of Eurasia, you've got a vast landmass, and like, we just go along the coast and run into Australia. That doesn't make much sense. And so what they came up with instead was that maybe there was two groups, and that one group went along this coast and one group went along and populated, Asia. And then as they've done these more recent genetic, tests, they found that that's not true. They looked at Australians, the people in that region, they said there's no evidence of there being two separate populations, that whoever populated the planet, it was one colonization event of one people, right? So that wipes out the only patch that they could put on this out of Africa theory. Yeah. And so they've had to accept, well, that didn't happen. So they're trying to say that instead, these people, for some unknown reason, came out of Africa at the worst possible time, ran along the coasts of Southeast Asia, and built the first boat in the world and sailed into Australia. All for no reason, right? And all out of any reasonable context, in the worst time they could have done it, when the environment is in a cataclysm following the biggest supervolcanic eruption in the world, known in 2.5 million years. Right? That doesn't make any sense. I mean, we've got to think these are people like us. We're not talking about monkeys or something. These are people like us. You don't do things like that. If you're sitting in your lovely warm lands in South Africa, you don't think, hey everyone, let's just move into the hellscape over there where there's no food, there's nothing, and let's run along hoping that we find some magical land that we've never heard of that'll be great to live in. I mean, people don't do that. That's not how we are. We just don't do that. So it's unreasonable on even on common sense and logical levels. If you reverse that, it makes perfect sense. And there's another reason why it makes sense. Not only do you see an entrance around about 70,000 years ago, they see the emergence of a mitochondrial lineage in Africa, in East Africa, called the L3 lineage. The L3 lineage is important because it's the only considered African lineage, right, that is related to non-African people. Because they say, well, we find it in East Africa, And, you know, it was related to two others called the M and N lineages. The M and N are basically foundational for all non-Africans on the planet, right? And they, you know, these three are very closely related, and they seem to appear at almost exactly the same time, right? And the interesting thing about the L3 lineage is it appears in Africa where? East Africa, right on the entrance point, and it moves westward into the country. And that's by the academic's own admission, it spreads westwards into Africa. Well, isn't that going into Africa then? Because you're telling me these people are going out of Africa, but that lineage is going in, right? So again, as I say, these people are coming into Africa. They're survivors from the disaster. So it's, I mean, when you look at it, you start thinking, but how can the academics miss this? Because they're telling you it. They're saying, well, yeah, there was a terrible catastrophe going on. There's a global disaster. There's a lineage moving west into Africa. You know, it's like, in a way, you can't, how did they ever spin it the other way? Because it doesn't make sense. And the M and N, which are the foundational to all of, you know, all non-Africans, were never in Africa. And that's universally agreed on. You know, they say, yeah, I mean, these lineages that are foundational to all non-Africans, they were never in Africa. No trace of them. You know, they think, oh, maybe they arose from these L3 lineages as they moved out of Africa and then it split. But as I said, it's moving west. It's not moving east. So it doesn't make sense. And they know that these lineages, you know, are separate to African lineages. So there's a mystery there. And the other problem as well you find is that around about 70,000 years ago, you see down the coast of southeast, the tip of Africa, there's a number of cave sites along there, which they found, evidence of early, you know, modern humans going back about 70,000 years again. And they found I think it's about 4 cave sites, the Blombos Caves, the Borders Cave, there's Classius Rivermouth Caves. All of these sites basically have been linked to the ancestors of the Khoisan and the sub-Saharan Africans, who were the oldest African group, you know, out of all the African lineages. They're the very oldest, and they're different to other Africans. They're not the same. People are Africans. When they talk about out of Africa and the oldest Africans and all of this, what they're really talking about is sub-Saharan Africans, which is a small group, the Khoisan peoples, right? Not Negroid Africans, right? So that's one thing as well people are not really aware of, that we're not talking about. The Negroid Africans are a younger race, as are like, you know, Asians and Europeans and stuff. We're all considered younger races. There's only this small group, the sub-Saharans. And you find these cave sites that relate to them, right? And these cave sites are precisely where watercraft would arrive in Africa that were escaping from Indonesia. Because what happens, the currents take you down to Madagascar. And then from Madagascar, obviously it's a short trip to the Southeast African shorelines. And all of the cave sites are along that shoreline. Bizarre, but true, you know. So yeah, so again, you see a two-pronged escape route. The people that could sail, sailed. The people that couldn't sail had to walk along the coast. And so you see 2 entrances into Africa after the Lake Toba event. And they both hit Africa where you'd expect people to coming from Australasia and Indonesia to arrive. If that's not a bizarre coincidence, you know, I don't know what is. And it doesn't really even stop there, because what you find is that these early Khoisan people, they take some things with them. One thing is they take a form of artwork, you know, because they find it, the Blombos Caves, there's some famous rocks called the Blombos Stones or Blombos Rocks. Engraved on these are a kind of cross-hatch pattern. And it's supposed to be like one of the first flowerings of human consciousness, because, you know, it's abstract art. And they say, well, okay, when you've got abstract art, you've got, you know, all of the things that come with that, you know, abstract thinking, maybe dance, ritual, you know, whatever else. We're starting to think outside the box. You know, that's the first signs of, you know, the lights have gone on. But then, like, about a year ago or so, they found a shell in Indonesia which has the same crosshatch pattern on it, but it's 500,000 years old.
So much for that theory, eh?
So much for that. Yeah. So the lights have been on a while now, you know, and they've come on down in Southeast Asia and down in that region. So, and you've got these people and they're carrying, they turn up and they've got that same pattern on their sacred rocks. So where are they coming from then?
Yeah.
I think 500,000 years is a bit earlier than 70,000. So I'm saying that they're coming from, I think they're bringing this down from there, that they've sailed across and they've brought that with them. The other thing that they have is a revered, like, entity or deity, a creator spirit, that's a giant serpent that created aspects of the landscape. Well, where have I heard that before? It's like the rainbow serpent. You know, that's probably one of the best known, you know, Australian Aboriginal tales, isn't it, as the rainbow serpent creating the landscape. And there you've got these people who are connected to a pattern from Southeast Asia on the shoreline where you'd expect people to arrive from Southeast Asia who have a belief in the same creator spirit, right? So I'm going with the fact that these are people that have sailed there, right, from Australasia and from Southeast Asia. And then, as I say, in East Africa, we're seeing these lineages coming in, moving westward. So the evidence is very strong in when I say about these inter-Africa movements. It's not a fantasy thing that, I've conjured up. People can go away and they can check all of those facts themselves, They'll be able to see that, this is a very, very strong case. And that, in many ways, it makes you think, how did we ever believe it was the other way around? Right? And that's the main into Africa events. But, we're still missing one thing here, which is, of course, well, how did the world become populated? Right? Because this is just to do with Toba and people escaping and stuff. This is not the populating of the world. Then the environment changes again. It takes a while, but around about 60,000 years ago, there's an improvement in the climate. And at that point is when we start to see this colonization. They actually calculate, they think it's about 200 people, the foundation, for all non-Africans, which is quite amazing. And also, I always wonder about that because 200 is a number that comes up in the Bible, isn't it? The 200, supposed like angels or whatever, they go and breed with the women of men or whatever, in the Genesis story. But it's kind of funny because they actually calculate, they think it's about 200 people that originally seed the world, outside of Africa. But anyway, these people migrate up, in my view, from up through Southeast Asia, from Australasia. And I have a good reason for saying that, because when you look at genetic data and you look at what they call the haplogroups, you'll find that there's some very archaic lines down in Australia, what they call, the M lineages. And these move up through Southeast Asia. And that's not controversial. They say, it seems like they're moving up through Southeast Asia. And there's certain traits like shovel-shaped teeth that move up through Southeast Asia into East Asia, and a good reason to think there's an expansion going in that direction. But the academics, of course, they're still clinging on to this thing of that Australia is only populated 50,000 years ago by people moving south, right? Desperately clinging on to this, even though it doesn't make any sense. And you can see that these haplogroups basically start to populate through Asia. You have what they call the C haplogroup, which again moves up through most of East Asia, through parts of Central Asia and into Northern Asia. That basically is spreading up from there and is closely related to the Australian haplogroups. So you can see if you look on basically on maps of where the distribution is of these, it becomes fairly apparent to people. You can see, hang on a minute, this is like flowing up from that region. And there's no denying as well that these are the oldest people in that region, which is the other problem. You say that, well, okay, if people came down into Australia from Asia, right, Asians should be the oldest people. I mean, that's pretty simple logic, isn't it? They say, no, hang on a minute, Australians diverged from Africans at least 70,000 years ago, already accepted to be the oldest, culture, the people that have been on their land the longest on the planet, et cetera, that these people are deeply old. They're older than Asians. But how do we say they came from Asia? You say, but they sailed in from Asia. But who was in Asia? Nobody was there, right? Because there's nobody older than them in that whole region. And no scientist would point at someone and say, look, there's an older person. No, it's just not true. So they know that these are the oldest modern humans in that region. So where else are people flowing from? They crossed over into Southeast Asia. They begin to populate. And even the people they describe as like, Proto-Asian in Asia are actually considered Australoid people, i.e. they look like Australians, right? Well, probably because they are, and these are their own descriptions, these Australoid peoples. And at the same time, this is when you get them into America as well, which, I don't cover in the book, but they basically, in my view, certainly they've walked up around into America. And if you look at haplogroups, you'll see that there's a direct correlation between Australia and America. And it becomes very obvious. You look on a map and they'll show you the leading haplogroups in America. And the only place there's a big match to them is Australia. So these people have walked up around, through Asia and have crossed into America as well, very early.
And so, we have a lot of stuff going on here in the Americas, where there's a lot of discrepancy and, everybody's coming out with these different theories. And I'll be happy when, we get this all straightened out, because, all of these theories, most of them just don't make sense to me. Just kind of like,
Hmm.
the stuff that you found when you were in there going, no, I don't think so.
Yeah. Yeah. There's these
For
big red
sure.
flags that there's another story, in
Yeah.
the Americas.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, we can touch on that a bit, as I say, I think that, that people walked over, across the, probably some people over the land bridge, certainly, but I also think people are sailing. I think that we can't keep on with this kind of, I guess the academic kind of narrow mind that people are just walking everywhere. I think that's not realistic, because if we've got people sailing a million years ago, like even if it's on like crappy little rafts or something, I think that by, 60,000 years ago, people have got boats. They're sailing in boats by this point. It's unreasonable to say they're not, because we found evidence of, now they've shown that 200,000 years ago in the Mediterranean, people were sailing between the islands.
Right.
There's evidence of somebody sailing to Socotra off the tip of Africa. Someone sailed down to an island there about 900,000 years ago. Obviously, you got this sailing in Indonesia a million years ago. So you're telling me that people are going to walk across the ice if they can just sail across the sea? Like, I don't buy it.
Right. Right. Exactly. Exactly.
I don't know about you, Rebecca. What should you prefer? Should we walk through this glacier, to grim this glacier, or just build a boat and just sail across? It's like,
Gee,
it's a
let me
no-brainer.
think. Yeah. 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 For sure. For sure. And that is one of the things that they've talked about, is the land bridges. They've shown that in different, shows, documentaries and stuff have shown the boats and where they've went and the evidence that they've found. And, the whole idea here is that Christopher Columbus, that's the story they've told us since I was a kid,
Hmm.
discovered, quote unquote, America. Well, I'm sorry, there was already people here, so he
Yeah.
didn't
Yeah.
discover anything. It was already here
No.
and inhabited.
Hmm. Yeah. And now they've shown it. The Chinese had been around the world and stuff before him as well,
Yeah,
and met everybody,
yeah.
and, and really, yeah, like so much that's come up, the anomalies that, I tell you another one of these anomalies that comes up again about the populating of America, because, at the moment, okay, there's this controversy about that site that they found, 130,000-year-old, mastodon bones being broken and all that. Okay, there's a raging controversy over that, but certainly there's sites down in South America and stuff that are suggesting people were on the continent by about 40,000, 50,000 years ago, that they're finding, not just in South America, actually, in parts of the southern US as well. I can't remember the site is, but I know there's an academic that's been digging up the remnants of fires, like, cooking fires, and they're dated to about 40,000, 50,000 years ago. Yeah, but also down in, Mexico and down into, like, South America, they found a number of these sites. So somebody's there by about 50, 60,000 years ago. And what we find is, that they've done this genetic testing again down in, the jungles. You may have seen this, but they found that among some of the peoples in Brazil, in the Brazilian Amazon, I always suspected if you looked at the people in the deep Amazon that they were going to find traces of these people, because, these are isolated groups, right? So obviously they preserve part of the genetic signature of whoever is first on the continent, because they've become
Right.
deeply isolated. And that's exactly what happened. They did the testing, I think it's just over a year ago, and they found that a couple of these tribes that they'd tested carry about 2% of a Australoid, like Australian, Oceanian genome, making them closely related to an archaic Australian and, I can't remember the other name, but the Polynesian, no, Melanesian, sorry, not Polynesian. Making them closely related to kind of, Melanesians and Australians. And they know this is a really deep, like, ancestry that's at some point long, long ago, before in prehistory, that there was, people from Australasia there. And, there's a preservation of that signature, but it's not just the DNA, right? Because there's something more mysterious about this, because like I found that there's another correlation. They found that, if you look at the astronomy of one of these groups, they say that when they look up into the night sky and they look at the Milky Way and you see that dark rift, right? They see this long flightless bird. I've forgotten the exact name, but it looks like an emu, right? It's closely related to an emu, looks like an emu. They see it stretching along the dark rift. And you go through Australia and you ask people what they see an emu in the dark rift, right? But that's pretty mind-bending, because you think, well, So they have 2% Australian genetics, and when they look up in the night sky, they see the same damn thing in the sky. Right. This is a deep ancestry and a deep cultural link, that these people are not just genetically related, they're culturally related. So when these people arrived, they already had this culture. This culture is at like 50,000 years old. You know, when it went out into the world, they already had some of these astronomy and like the other things, and they carried it with them. And as I say, in South Africa, you find the Blombos Rock. They're carrying that artwork 70,000 years ago. You know, 50,000 years ago in America, they're carrying the astronomy. So we're talking about an advanced, if you like, or developed culture that is going around the world like 50, 60, 70,000 years ago, taking its understandings with it and like leaving that understanding in places. So, I mean, that's another part of this story, which is not really come to light yet. And obviously that's part of what I'm doing, is bringing it to light, is that we need to understand that this culture is deep, deep, deep in our history, and it's global.
And, you know, I'm going to tell you, Bruce, this is honestly, reading this book was really fascinating, and listening to you on the show tonight has just been just an absolute joy and a treasure, for sure. You touched on so many things in this book, and I can see where there's a whole lot of different legs that you can, you know, take off and continue your research and studies into some of these other topics that tie this even more in together. I mean, you know, you've touched upon the cultural thing. You've touched upon the ships and how we could migrate and et cetera and so forth. There's just a lot of different arms here and legs that you can take.
Mm-hmm.
What's in the future here for you? What are you looking at for your future topics for books?
Yeah, I mean, I've got to cover the Americas. I have a lot of material sitting in my hard drive about the Americas. I mean, that was, originally this was a longer book, you know, that I've split up. So there is like a whole load of material there about Ecuador, about the site there. I want to cover the story of that, you know, discovery, not just of my own involvement, but the other Ecuadorian groups that went in there, and tell a bit of the story, because there's some, you know, drama in that as well, from like one group that went in there and got trapped in the jungle at night and had kind of experiences. And so, I mean, I want to tell some of that, and also, yeah, the investigation in Ecuador. And then, yeah, the way that this relates, the whole American story relates back into this Australian narrative, and also the rise of this culture, this global culture, and its fall, you know, around 12,000 years ago, which is, of course, everyone knows, is this period of disaster that a lot of, you know, big name writers are covering, you know, obviously Graham Hancock and Robert Schoch and Andrew Collins, and, you know, everyone in this area of study at some point gets onto that 12,000 years ago disasters, you know, the rising sea levels and all of that. So yeah, I probably will give my own perspective on that, and the culture that was there when the disasters came, you know, and what I see being there about them, and where they were and what they've left us. So that's going to be part of it. I'm in talks with a literary agent. He said basically if I can extend the book I've got to about 90,000 words, and get some endorsements from other authors and academics, that he feels there's a reasonable chance to be able to sort of take me on and get a book deal. In which case, you know, I will be putting this all into a singular print volume. So that's probably the project I'm really aiming towards. I mean, so if anyone out there is, you know, an author or an academic and is willing to look at the work and offer an endorsement on it, you don't have to agree with all of my theories, more of an endorsement on my research process and the writing, then that would be very helpful, because I need to throw in a few of those, because I'm not a PhD, so they need the
Well, I
endorsements.
hear that. Well, listen, I want to make mention of Bruce, or of Steve and Evan Strong, because they mentioned you when they were on, and so lovely people, by the way, such as yourself. You're just a lovely person. You and your wife. I just so enjoy listening to you, and you sent pictures from to me from when you were in Ecuador and the site that you were at, and I can hardly wait to really sit down and explore that with you. So I would, you know, just love to have you come back and give some of your other theories. Doesn't even have to necessarily do with any of the books that you're going on, because there was a whole bunch of questions that we didn't get to tonight. You know, talking about giants and some other discoveries made along the way, and this wasn't part of this particular book for you, but I think it's part of your wheelhouse, and I think we could just have a lovely time going through and visiting with some of those other things that didn't quite get into this one, may not get into any of your other ones, but certainly interesting topics nonetheless.
Yeah, and just quickly as well, can I add as well that in reference to Stephen Evan, not only could people grab their book, obviously, which is the Out of Australia Theory, and they cover some different stuff to me. There's an overlap, probably 10% of our material overlaps. I've gone a bit more global and through time, but, they cover cultural things, stuff that I don't cover. So I'd say to people, grab that. And also we've got an online conference coming up where, they're on it, I'm on it, there's, a few other people, and that's going to be on, the 17th of June. So, if people want to have a look at that, they'll be able to go on to probably Forgotten Origins or, website, because it's on there now,
What's the name of it?
There's, forgottenorigin.com. So if people go on there, they'll find, there's in the webinars section there, they'll find that. So they can book. It's $10. There's, like six speakers, $10. So, I think it's well worth people jumping on. I'll be talking probably some of what we've covered here, but, obviously each speaker will be covering their angle of the topics. So that's the next thing we've got sort of coming up together with the Strongs and myself. And of course, their book's out, so people can get print or Kindle versions of their book, which is already out. Mine's an e-book only, so people that like an old-fashioned book will probably have to make do with theirs at the moment until I eventually do a print one. So anyway, there's a bit of, we've got something coming up together.
Well, I'm just excited to see you putting all of this information, this lovely information, all together. It was correlated very well. It read very easy as far as a linear timeline was concerned, which makes it really good for people that don't like to jump back and forth. And you didn't jump back and forth. You were very, you went with a flow. There was definitely a flow there with that. Mm-hmm. I've been putting up your link to Amazon tonight in the chat room, so people can go and get your ebook there at Amazon.com. And I just think there's just a whole lot more good just coming forward for you, Bruce. I think there's just a whole bunch of stuff. It just is lovely. And I really would like to invite you back whenever you want. And if you will email me the information on your webinar that you're going to be participating in, I'd be happy to put it into my newsletter for people to, as a reminder, and also post it on my web pages. I'd be happy to do that for you if you'll send that to me, and so
absolutely.
that people can find it. And these are topics that people are really, really interested in. I mean, this is our history, the history that we have never been shown or told, and there's people such as yourself that are adventurous and researchers that have gone out on your own, and you've, garnered all the information, you've done the work, and you've put it all together for people like me that can just sit down and read it. It's a wonderful thing. It really is. It gets us all outside of the box. And it's time we all get outside of the box. That box is going away.
I'll just say as well that there's an article coming out in New Dawn in July, I think I've got coming out as well, just for anyone that reads New Dawn. And that covers Göbekli Tepe. And, I throw out some pretty big revelations about Göbekli Tepe, which, I think a lot of people are gonna...
Oh my God, you'll have to come back and at least talk to us about that now.
Yeah, it's gonna be, I think it's gonna be, it's gonna, probably, maybe even upset a few people, because there's people out there speculating. There's a lot of theories out there about Göbekli Tepe, and I think people are going to be quite astonished when they read my article. Quite surprised.
Oh my gosh, now see, you've just got my interest piqued. I haven't read that,
so you keep an eye out. Yeah, when it comes out, I'll let you know, so I'll flag it up to you.
Please. And that way I can also keep the audience up to date too, the people that are following, some of these interesting things. But we will have to invite you back, just to cover a myriad of topics. Mm-hmm. Because I think you have a really interesting perspective, and you're so down to earth, and it's just fabulous to have you back. It really is.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I really appreciate you having me on again.
Well, like I said, anytime you just let me know. I would love to have you and your wife back on. I know it's been quite a few years, but it's been lovely. And I want to thank you so much for being here. And of course, JP, for your engineering, Tobias, and to all of you, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And until we meet again, where will your life's journey lead you? Many blessings, everyone, and good night. Good night, Bruce.
Okay, good night. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.